Little Lee, a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, written by Catherine Ringhoff. Once there was a beautiful young witch whose name was Little Lee. She lived in Spookville. Little Lee was very kind and very smart. Everyone in town loved her. Little Lee came from the only family of witches and wizards left in town. Tonight was the annual Halloween ball, and Little Lee needed to make her way back to the school to help Mrs. Jones set up the decorations. The Halloween ball took place every year, but this was the very first Little Lee could attend. She was finally old enough to dance and boogie with the other goblins and monsters in Spookville. Little Lee was so excited to go bobbing for eyeballs, she could hardly contain herself. She ran out the door so fast she almost forgot her shoes. Little Lee noticed that it was very dark out, and she had never walked through the woods when it was dark out before. Though she knew if she stayed on the path, she would be able to find the school. Little Lee knew that the school was a good half-hour walk from her home, but she was confident and knew the way. She was not afraid to go by herself. When Little Lee had walked far enough into the woods to feel just a bit lonely, who should she meet but a sly and hungry fox? She had no idea what a nasty animal Fox would be. However, she was not at all frightened by him. Fox was enchanted and happened to be 3 sizes too large, big enough to scare just about anybody off. Besides Little Lee. "Good evening, little girl," said Fox. "Good evening, Fox. My name is Little Lee," answered Little Lee, always keeping in mind to be kind to others. "Where are you off to so late in the evening, my sweet girl?" said Fox. "I'm going to the school for the annual ball." "Is that so? The annual ball? With all the children of Spookville?" asked Fox. Yeah, that's right. With all my friends and classmates? Oh, and don't forget my teacher, Mrs. Jones, will be there too," said Little Lee. "Now isn't that nice? And where exactly is this school?" asked Fox. "Oh, it's about a good 10-minute walk into the rest of the woods. The school is the one right by the 3 large stones and the big apple tree. It's right next to the school. We hear the apples falling on the roof all day," replied Little Lee. Fox then thought to himself, "I could eat sweet Little Lee, or I could run to the school, eat the teacher there, and leave Little Lee for a sweet dessert. I must be clever about this. I could make a feast of these 2, thought Fox. Fox walked along with Little Lee for a while, and making polite conversation too, asking things like, "What is your favorite book to read?" To which Little Lee replied, "There was an old lady who swallowed a fly." And that is when Fox slipped away into the woods to leave Little Lee there by herself. Lee was confused but never scared. She kept on her journey and knew the school was right ahead. Meanwhile, the fearless Fox went straight to Spookville High. And when he arrived, he knocked softly on the door. "Who's there?" said Mrs. Jones. "It's me, Little Lee," said Fox in a tiny voice. "I've come for the annual Halloween ball." "Okay, Little Lee, I just have to lift the latch and open up the door," shouted Mrs. Jones. Fox could hear Mrs. Jones' footsteps getting closer and closer. With every step, Fox's mouth filled more and more with water. Fox could not wait to eat her. Mrs. Jones opened the school door, and without even saying good evening, Fox ate her up, poor Mrs. Jones, just in one gobble. Then Fox knew if he found a clean outfit to put on and waited patiently for Little Lee to arrive, maybe he could convince her he was Mrs. Jones. In the meantime, little Lee was skipping and singing on her way to the annual Halloween ball when she suddenly felt uneasy. The doors were shut, the music was off, and there were no balloons anywhere in sight. Little Lee began to tiptoe towards the school. She felt quite frightened, but didn't know why. "What's wrong?" she thought. "I always love coming to the school, and I love Mrs. Jones so much. Why do I feel so afraid? Can it be that Mrs. Jones is sick?" "Hello? Anybody here?" called little Lee as she approached the school door. But there was no answer. Little Lee then pushed open the doors to the school to find Mrs. Jones's back. "Phew!" said little Lee. "I thought something happened to you, Mrs. Jones," said little Lee. Just then, Mrs. Jones turned around and she looked very odd. Little Lee could not help but stare. "Mrs. Jones? Are you okay? What big, hairy ears you've grown," little Lee said. "The better to hear you with, my darling," said Fox. "Oh, Mrs. Jones, your eyes are so shiny." "The better to see you with, my dear." "Your hands look so strange, Mrs. Jones." "The better to catch and hug you, my dear." "Please, Mrs. Jones, why do you have such big, sharp teeth?" "Those are to eat you with, my dear." Just as Fox said this, he jumped up and ate poor little Lee. After finishing the good and full meal, the fearless Fox fell fast asleep and began snoring ever so loudly, as loud as you could ever possibly imagine. Not long after Fox had fallen asleep, Rusty, our only ogre in all of Spookville, and his dad were making their way to the school. Rusty's dad, Mr. Ogre, had always been our security guard here at Spookville High. As Mr. Ogre approached the school, he started to hear the loud snoring and thought that it was very strange that Mrs. Jones had fallen asleep. Mr. Ogre walked right into the school, and to his surprise, he saw Fox laying there fast asleep. And he was wearing Mrs. Jones's clothes. With a fat stomach full to bursting, right away, Mr. Ogre guessed what had happened. "So, here you are, you old sinner," Mr. Ogre said. "I have been looking for you all these years, and this is where I find you." Mr. Ogre picked up Fox and held him by his foot. Mr. Ogre started to shake Mr. Fox until out popped and cried little Lee. "Oh, thank you! I was so very frightened. It was so dark inside the fox." Next, Mrs. Jones fell out and could hardly breathe from fright and exhaustion. They thanked Mr. Ogre with all their hearts, and he was so glad to see them both alive and well that he hugged little Lee and shook Mrs. Jones's hand over and over again. They were all quite happy. Mr. Ogre, Rusty, Mrs. Jones, and little Lee began to clean up the mess that Fox had left behind. They helped to continue setting up for the annual Halloween ball. Shortly after the music and disco ball were turned on, and all of the balloons were blown up, did the rest of the monsters and goblins of Spookville arrive. Everyone danced and partied until the sun came up, and Fox never bothered anyone ever again.